My name is Mukobe Masuta, and I'm Manager for Research, Strategy, and Policy Analysis at the African National Congress. I would like to welcome everyone who is joining us live on Facebook and YouTube platforms. And as a way of background, today marks our second session of the Basic Income Debate Series. We started this series on the 28th of August with Professor Guy Standing of the University of London laying a foundation and an overview of the historical origins of the idea of universal basic income, the global experience so far, as well as policy options for South Africa. We also drew lessons from countries that have experimented with universal basic income, countries such as Finland, Canada, India, and Namibia. As indicated, the idea of a basic income as a way of providing basic social and economic security, particularly to the vulnerable and marginalized, is not new. In fact, Dutch historian Rutger Bregman traces it as far back as 200 years ago. Equally so, just before his assassination in 1967, Martin Luther King wrote as follows: "I am convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income," which is one way in which others refer to it. In this second session of our Basic Income Debate Series, we get closer to home and zoom into how the idea of a basic income grant has evolved as a part of a comprehensive social security policy in post-apartheid South Africa. And there is no better person to help us navigate this idea than Professor Vivian Taylor, whose academic research and advocacy experience spans well over 30 years here at home and around the world. Professor Taylor was head of University of Cape Town's Department of Social Development. She was the principal author and researcher of South Africa's first 2 human development reports sponsored by the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP. In 2008, she completed a 50-country research study for the African Union on social protection. She's also widely published with well over 60 publications in book chapters, research and peer-reviewed articles, as well as conference papers. But perhaps most importantly, Professor Taylor is also a commissioner of the National Planning Commission, which gave us South Africa's National Development Plan, our blueprint development policy. Secondly, we are also joined by Dr. Thabang Masilo Sifalafala, who is lecturer and researcher at Wits University. Thabang holds a PhD in economic sociology from Wits, and his research pays particular attention to the experience of South Africa's unemployed, the experiences of security guards, as well as former mine workers. His latest thought-provoking article published on the South African Labour Bulletin cautions us against the idea of reducing a person's worth to the job they hold. During an era of COVID-19 related jobs bloodbath, Thabang's research has never been more relevant. Perhaps most importantly, exactly 13 years ago, I was a first-year student with Thabang in sociology at Wits, and I'm particularly proud that him and Professor Taylor have joined us this afternoon, or rather evening, to share their inputs on the idea of a basic income grant and its feasibility or relevance to South Africa. Without wasting much time, I would like to start with you, Professor Taylor. It's exactly 22 years since the 1998 Jobs Summit that first proposed a basic income grant in South Africa, and exactly 18 years since your groundbreaking Taylor report. Looking back, what conditions necessitated this recommendation at the time, and what about the new South Africa were you and your colleagues trying to remedy at the time?
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be part of this debate. I think it's really important that we do frame the discussion on the policy options and what constitutes a basic income grant within the framework of broader social protection. I'm really pleased that you are starting by looking backwards and asking about 1998, where we've come from in 1998, the issues around employment and job security. 1998 was indeed a significant turning point in our country. If you will recall, it was 4 years since the introduction of democracy and the election of a new government. So the political environment was conducive towards more collective and public good. It was also 2 years since the adoption of the South African Constitution in 1996, which was a groundbreaking constitution in the sense that it entrenched the human rights and citizenship rights of people who had formerly been disenfranchised and who could regard themselves now as full citizens within the country of their birth. So it was groundbreaking in those two areas. Furthermore, when we look back, the research and statistical evidence on the state of poverty and inequality in the country exposed to us the terrible conditions under which the majority lived. Besides statistical trends that we investigated at the time and that many others investigated, we looked beyond that through an initiative that was called the Speak Out on Poverty campaign. That was initiated in 1998 by the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, and a broad base of civil society organizations. And these Speak Out on Poverty campaigns were hugely important at the time. The campaigns engaged directly with people across the country to hear from them about their lived realities. It's very easy for us to dehumanize the context in which people live by looking at statistical trends and looking at the incidents. And this gives you an indication of how far people are, just gives you an indication in terms of numbers. It does not give you the sense of the realities of the acute suffering and the long-term effects of poverty and inequality of people. So through the campaign, the Speak Out on Poverty campaign, we were able to engage with people on what mattered to them, how they experienced the new democracy, and how they understood their rights and their right to access some of the social and economic rights embedded in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And what we found was the shocking reality and desperate plight of millions of people. Many of them were alienated already in 1998 from the new state. They were living on the edge of starvation and their survival was at stake. These were the factors that informed my approach to how I would look at comprehensive social security. So when I was appointed to chair the Committee on Comprehensive Social Security in 1999, the government gave us a very broad brief. It included a review of all social security benefits, including what we know of today as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, private pensions, including provident funds. It included an analysis of the Road Accident Fund, health insurance, and both the private pension fund industry as well as the health insurance industry are multi-billion-dollar industries. And there were huge vested interests in investigating their, what they were doing. And besides health insurance, importantly, we were asked to investigate social assistance, mainly social cash grants. This included the social old age pension, the disability grant, the child support grant, which gave children up to the age of 7 a nominal amount. And we were asked, importantly, to investigate the feasibility of a basic income. We also had the task of looking at the institutional arrangements for social security and financing of social security. So it was indeed a wide brief. Our committee was a team of technical experts from various professional backgrounds. It was not representative, and the committee also had divergent value orientations and ideological perspectives. Not everyone had the same view on what ought to be done and how it should be done. So the committee itself was a site of policy engagements and debates, and before we arrived at consensus that was reflected in the report that you referred to. So where are we today? Well, we conducted our investigations between 1999 and 2001. And we conducted research, received hundreds of written and oral submissions, and had wide-ranging consultations. We heard painful stories and experiences from people. The examples are many, but one is etched in my memory, and it's one that I told to people from the private sector, the pension and health industries, when they came to make a representation on the interests of their members, and one that I shared with many others. During the time when we had consultations with people, an elderly social pensioner came to one of the consultations that the committee held. It was in Cape Town. And she related her story of how her daughter with 2 children killed herself and her children by standing in front of a train because she could not feed her children. The pensioner's question to us was, why did my daughter and grandchildren have to die? And how can we help others and help others who have no income to feed themselves? So the issue then was, how do we take these real experiences and lessons and translate it into a policy and proposals that could apply to everyone across the country? At the time, we had a socioeconomic context. The reality, the evidence showed us we had deepening poverty, we had increasing social inequalities, and intractable structural unemployment issues that were as a result of the post-colonial era, together with economic globalization issues. And it was imperative, given that scenario, that the existing social protection system was strengthened to address the gaps and exclusions and provide effective social and economic support to all who needed it through bad times and good times. Because the bad times hit us in waves, in economic and financial crises, in health pandemics, a wave of health pandemics, as well as they hit us in terms of governance crises and other crises. So how do we ensure that our system of social protection, with the benefits, with the income support, can help the poorest of the poor weather the bad times and stabilize those people who are within the system in good times? Now, we argued at the time, and we still do from within the Planning Commission, that such support ought to be a platform for social well-being and an economic stabilizer for those who are excluded from social assistance in the form of a basic income. There are three imperatives that reinforce the need to introduce a basic income. There are four, but I'll focus on, there are many others, but I'll just focus on three. The first imperative is South Africa's Constitution, Section 27. It establishes legally enforceable obligations on government that encompass, that include every aspect of a system of social protection. Income support, food security, access to basic services, water, and unqualified support to children. I won't read out Section 27, but it's in the Constitution. The state in Section 27 also indicates that the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of the right of access to social security and social assistance. So that's the first imperative. If the state does not fulfill those obligations, it can be taken to the Constitutional Court to show that it must. This aspect of the Constitution fits with a human rights and social justice framework. The issues around the philosophical and ethical issues around social justice must gear us towards ensuring that we comply with the Constitution and that we deliver on a just dispensation for South Africa's citizen. It implies that by virtue of their citizenship, all South Africans have the right of access to social security and social assistance. The second imperative is a political and democratic imperative. Now, many of you might recall that the ANC campaigned in its election manifesto pre-1994 for basic welfare rights for all. And this was also included in the RDP, which is a tripartite, the Reconstruction and Development Program, which is a tripartite policy document. This was followed 8 years later by an ANC policy conference in 2002 in Stellenbosch, during which a resolution was passed to adopt the recommendation arising from the report of the Taylor report for comprehensive social protection and to continue to engage with social partners on the feasibility of a basic income grant. So this was a resolution of the ANC policy conference in 2002. Now, as I've already said, there was also a social and economic imperative to implement a universal basic income, given the conditions in the country, high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, and high levels of exclusion from any form of social protection. So those were some of, if we look back, those were some of the features and conditions that led to us recommending very strongly that to address poverty, to address inequality, and to ensure social cohesion, we needed to introduce a basic income grant.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that comprehensive response, and thank you for detailing the deeply consultative process that led to the recommendation that we're speaking about today. And perhaps before I move on to Thabang, I just want to ask you that as you have stipulated already, the basic income idea is not new at all.
Yes.
But you and your colleagues have been advocating for this for years. So perhaps the question now is, to what do you attribute the sudden global and local interest on a basic income grant? Because it's not just a South African momentum, it's actually in both fairly developed and emerging economies.
Very important question. Doug, I think that there has been a significant shift in thinking, both nationally within our country, as well as on the continent of Africa and globally. Now, what has given rise to this shift? Many have argued, including a person I respect and worked with for some years, Professor Amartya Sen, that the globalization has created conditions for huge wealth. But the increase in wealth across the globe has also led to huge inequalities. And Piketty has also indicated to us, given us evidence of how inequalities, wealth and income inequalities across the globe have increased. Now, in this context of huge wealth inequalities, we've seen huge increases in poverty on the continent of Africa, and we've seen increasing exclusions and marginalization. We've also seen that people who've historically struggled to find work because they did not have the capabilities, the education, the skill sets required by modern industrialization or by modern economies, they couldn't enter labor markets. So there's been an increase in those conditions. There's also been the continued exploitation of workers, the increasing casualization of labor, the increasing poverty of women and workers who are already in the labor force are earning below any acceptable poverty income line. So they are trapped in poverty despite being workers, despite being casual or informal workers. So those conditions are worsening across the globe. And in South Africa, they've also worsened. Added to South Africa's context are the inequities that have reproduced themselves, that we've inherited from apartheid, and that have reproduced themselves time and time again in new forms in the modern South African economy. So the issue is, how do we ensure, given this context, that we have effective redistribution and we have people at the bottom entering the economic system? We can talk about economic inclusion as often as we want, but it's not going to happen because we are talking about it all the time. We have to take concrete steps to make sure it happens. And one of those concrete steps, we believe, was to focus on those who are currently excluded from social security benefits, social protection, who are currently outside of the labor market and who are without incomes. And the best way we found to do that was through the issue of a universal basic income grant. Now, why are institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and OECD countries, as well as many other institutions, promoting social protection floors and a basic income grant? It's not out of charity or the goodwill of that they've suddenly had a reverse in their thinking. It's because it is mutually reinforcing. A basic income grant not only provides survival for those at the bottom end, it ensures predictability of income and human security for people at the bottom end. It allows them to have a degree of choice. It reduces poverty directly, and it reduces income inequality. What that does is it has a chain reaction on reductions in violence and crime. And it has a reduction in the security that people in high income areas and with obscene wealth can live. As long ago as 1885, a person in the UK, Joseph Chamberlain, asked the question when the discussion took place around how do we ensure that we have mobility of people at the bottom end, the poorest, into the economic system. He asked the question, what security or what ransom will property pay for the security it enjoys, it currently enjoys? Now, the issue is that those people who have immense wealth, who have property, cannot cut themselves off because they fear their own human well-being and their security and privilege is at risk. They cannot live behind electric fencing in gated communities, cordoned off from the rest of the country. That's unsustainable. Across the globe, we are seeing this happen, that more and more people are concerned about their human security and have realized that their security relies on ensuring that the least well-off have something to live on. That's the one part of it. The other is spreading income increases the potential for consumption growth. Without income, without your population having the income, the means to buy things for their households, to buy food, to go to a local shop and purchase food, your local economy is not going to develop. You're not going to have consumption growth. And generally, it's bad for the economy. So the realization that such high levels of income inequality as South Africa currently has, it's the highest in the world, is unsustainable. And it's bad not just for the poor, but it's also bad for the wealthy, and it's bad for the country as a whole. So there's been that recognition that reversed the thinking and has come full circle to where we were when we first proposed the basic income grant.
Thanks so much, Prof. In fact, across the Atlantic, Professor Chomsky is also cautioning that the level of obscene wealth and inequalities that you referred to cannot actually coexist with a healthy democracy. And in one way or another, this is likely to threaten the very stability that we live in. So I think your last point links very well with that idea. Before we go to some of the other more justifications for a basic income grant in South Africa today, I just want to move to Thabang, who, as I indicated earlier, is based at the University of the Witwatersrand, both as a researcher and a lecturer. Thabang, I cannot tell you how excited I am that you're actually part of this discussion for obvious reasons. But specifically, you recently wrote a thought-provoking article for the South African Labour Bulletin. And in this paper, you urge us to rethink the way we look at and think about unemployed people, as well as the multiple ways in which they are openly and as well as implicitly excluded from economic participation. Please walk us through that main argument of that paper, and then perhaps give us some form of examples of why you make that point.
Thank you, Dr. Mukobe. So I think the article was actually based on, I tried to bring in three different things. So to center the conversation around what's happening in the labor market on the one hand, what's happening with social security on the other hand, and the COVID-19. So one of the key points that I point out is that one of the most important lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa was the exposure of policy gaps in relation to the unemployed. And over the past 26 years, we have put a lot of focus on job creation and job guarantee schemes, and not enough attention on addressing the social security policy gaps, particularly in order to make it more comprehensive. And while we are yet to achieve our job creation targets, we have succeeded in creating something else. And that something else is a discourse in which people's value in society are measured by the jobs that they hold. So in other words, we have created a discourse, a society in which jobs have become an important measure of what it means to be a person of value in society. And so what's happened is that labor markets, and as far as we know from economics, that they contribute, because of the inability to create jobs, they contribute to inequality and poverty. But from a social point of view, labor markets are also boundaries of who is a person of value and who is not. Now, if you look at, currently having a job is one of the most important measures of what others call personhood. And that is why the unemployed often suffer stigma and humiliation. It's precisely because they lack this social good that everyone values. Pre-COVID-19, we already had over 10 million unemployed people. Before the lockdown, we had an unemployment rate of 30.1%. And in as far as hunger is concerned, over 14 million South Africans in 2019 went to bed hungry. And we have one of the highest inequality in the world, the Gini coefficient of over 0.6. After the lockdown, it was estimated that over 3 million people lost their jobs during the first or initial phases of the lockdown. Now, you can only imagine how many people will experience this type of uncertain and horrible life. And the main point, really, the main argument that I try to build in the paper is that while we need to create jobs, we should not allow this to blind us to the need for a comprehensive social security floor. And the reason I say this is because given the magnitude of the challenges of inequality, poverty, and unemployment that we face, which have now been made worse by COVID-19, we can no longer continue on the same old trajectory of a single approach, focusing on job creation alone. So I argue that in order for us to succeed, we need to think differently because we are living in a changing world. We can no longer only focus on job creation, but we should complement job creation with a comprehensive social security system in the form of a basic income grant. It's clear for everyone to see that, over the past number of years, the sole focus on, or the main focus on labor markets has led to the exclusion of over 10 million people, contributing directly to poverty and inequality in the country. And so that is why I argue for a double approach to address the magnitude. So we need to match the magnitude of the challenge that we face today by combining job creation and a comprehensive social security system. Now, if we look at the UIF, which is a short-term social insurance that is contribution-based, and covers only those that have contributed. But the reality in South Africa, especially among the young people that I'm part of, is that a lot of young people face intergenerational unemployment. A lot of our people today live in households where no one in that household has ever held a job. And there's also a possibility that some people may go throughout their lives without ever finding a job. Now, social grants continue to save a lot of families today from total starvation. And then when we look at job guarantee schemes like EPWP and CWP, they have also contributed to alleviating poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Although I believe we still need to do much more to address the kind of challenges that we face today. So a key realization that COVID-19 has brought upon us is that we need a comprehensive social security system as part of an adequate response to the challenges of inequality, poverty, and unemployment that we face as a nation. Now, the last point that I'll make on this is that the 6-month COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, the SRD, of 350 for the unemployed, I think actually came as a result of the realization that we need a comprehensive social floor, and we need to address some of the policy gaps, especially in relation to the unemployed. So I believe that this was a step in the right direction. I think that the SRD was a step in the right direction by our government. And now we need to go a step further to build a comprehensive social floor through a basic income grant.
Well, Tawang, before I move on to the next question, in this same paper, you argue that what COVID-19 will do is to make it even much more clearer to South Africa that the pursuit for jobs, which is just as important, pandemic or no pandemic, cannot guarantee security and dignity for all. This is such an important part of that paper, which I thought we should revisit. Why? Because when we had our first session of the Basic Income Grant debate series, a lot of feedback that we got was that, why don't you create jobs as opposed to giving people free money? People want jobs, not free money. In some way, there is an existing perception, whether we agree with it or not, in South Africa, that the extent to which people behave to an income that they receive has a lot to do with what they did for it to receive it. Of course, it's a very subjective view, because if you ask, or when I ask some of my colleagues or friends who actually have a job, whether they would value an additional 1,000 rand any less than they value their own salary, their debate, their response is quite funny. I want you to touch on that, because although it might not appear to be an issue for some of us who are converts of a basic income grant, how do we navigate that uncertainty amongst our people and that particular concern that somehow this is free money, which would encourage laziness, and also the idea that people approach or attitude towards a set of income is somehow linked to what they did for it. What would you have to say to that?
Well, certainly, even in my own work, the obvious thing that always comes up is people want jobs. They would prefer jobs over grants. But one has to ask the question, what if we can't create the jobs that everyone needs? Does it mean that those that don't have jobs should starve? Now, I don't think so. Now, you ask the question, what do I mean by jobs can't give security and dignity for all pre and post COVID-19. And I think historically, jobs have been understood as a source of security and dignity for the majority of the working class and the poor. However, the global growth of the precariat and the working poor, which is a term that we use here in South Africa as well, we're starting to realize that employment is no longer, perhaps, no longer able to provide the security and dignity commonly associated with it. And it's not just a South African phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. So the world is changing, and there's a lot of studies that seem to suggest that it's changing not in the direction of more jobs, right? Even if new jobs and new industries are created, it's in the direction of less jobs in the first instance. So you have a quantitative decline in the number of jobs first. And secondly, you have a qualitative decline in the quality of the jobs that will be produced by the new global economy. The popular term, the precariat, tries to capture this labor market insecurity that I'm alluding to. And of course, technological disruptions are not new either. In the short term, we should expect that there should be some labor market disruptions as a result of, the fourth industrial revolution, as some people call it, and technological disruptions. Now, if you combine the labor market disruptions due to technology, and you combine them with the COVID-19 induced crisis, you combine that with the challenges facing SMMEs, you add to that the relative inelasticity of the South African informal sector, and the millions of unemployed graduates and the so-called NEETs, the not in employment, education, or training, that join the labor market each year. And to that, you add the restructuring processes implemented by various corporates striving to reduce costs and become competitive, even before COVID-19. You realize that we are in a deep crisis. So that even the middle classes that we're beginning to realize that their jobs are not as secure as they once thought. Right, so it's not just the blue-collar workers, but it's also the educated, the skilled workers who are beginning to realize that the labor market, things are closing and becoming much more tighter. Now, the reality is that millions of South Africans, and indeed across the continent and across the world, people are feeling more and more marginalized. Yes, we need to create jobs, but the point is that jobs alone will not be the answer to the scale of the challenges that we are facing today. Even the most optimistic projection based on jobs growth show that we are not going to create, the 10 million jobs, 12 million or 15 million jobs in the next year, or by 2022, or by 2023. So I believe it's time that we think differently about how this world works and how we can achieve development and growth in a different way than we have been trying for the past 26 years, precisely because we are in a deep crisis. We can't keep on doing the same thing. We need to do something different. And I believe that thinking differently should include, in addition to job creation, a basic income grant as part of a comprehensive social floor. And this approach will help us to address unemployment, inequality, and poverty much faster than the ideology of job creation alone.
No, thanks for that. I think that was quite helpful, because before I move back to Professor Taylor, I can't help but recognize a very strong contradiction between, on the one hand, the extent of the SMME mortality rate, which is as high as you can imagine, and on the other hand, the NDP's commitment that over 2/3 of jobs that should be created in South Africa must come from the very same SMMEs. In other words, there is a very strong conflict between where the jobs must come from, as well as the gross mortality rate of the very SMMEs that are expected to give those jobs. But before we move on to issues of design, funding, as well as implementation, Professor Taylor, I just would like to just bring you back to ask, because I think before we discuss what a basic income grant ought to look like in South Africa today, we must perhaps pay a bit of attention to what are the current strengths and weaknesses of the present social assistance scheme that currently exists in South Africa, also known as social grants. You have both touched on them because they currently exist, but what about them is inadequate, and what is it that we're building on top of? Why do we need to do more? I think for someone who's looking from outside, looking into South Africa, will want to understand how a basic income grant might relate to an existing social grant system as we know it. Professor Taylor.
Okay, I'm with you again. Thank you. I actually want to start saying that the analysis provided by Dr. Thabang is entirely in line with our past thinking and current thinking. And just to reinforce the last point that was made by him, that South Africa, as well as other countries struggling with issues of poverty and inequality and exclusions, need to reconsider how we understand the word work, the reality of work, what it means, how it can be applied, and the shift in the policy and program discourse of moving from jobs to decent work. Why did that shift occur? And it occurred because of the reasons that Dr. Thabang has talked about. So I want to just reinforce that. And you're absolutely correct in asking us, before we look at the future and what we want to see shape our social protection system and how we fill the existing gaps, let's look at where we are today. The current social assistance grant system provides income support for approximately 17.5 million people at an approximate cost of 175 billion rand. Now, it might sound like a large amount, but that 175 billion rand has, in terms of expenditure, social protection expenditure, as a ratio of GDP, it has remained fairly constant over the last 20 years, with just a 1% increase as our GDP contracted or became smaller. So 175 billion was approximately 4% of social expenditure in relation to the GDP. Of these 17.5 million people, over 12 million, 12.2 million received the child support grant, and the rest receive a social old age pension and disability grants, as well as veterans and care dependency grants. Now, the important point to note about these grants, the CSG, the child support grant, is below the food poverty line of 590. So the grants do not remove people from below a poverty line, what is talked of as a lower bound poverty line of 785 Rand per month, unless the grants are indexed according to the cost of living and in accordance with an acceptable poverty line. And the poverty line that we use are an upper bound poverty line, and that is about 1,800 per month. So the grants, besides social old age pension, the other levels, the child support grant and even the special COVID relief, are not able to move people to a sufficient basis to survive food poverty. So that's one of the major issues. The other major issues is that those who are without paid work and in the age category over 18 to 59, who live in extreme poverty below this food poverty line, are currently excluded from the social protection system. And they are not in receipt. They don't receive any form of assistance, either food vouchers or transport or costs to go and seek work. So if you're 19 years, between 19 and 35, and you want to go and find a job, you don't have the bus fare to go and find a job. If you've just graduated from university, you don't have the money to go and get your CV done. There are very, very basic things that if you are a middle income earner, or if you're an upper income earner, that you take for granted you have access to. But if you are without any means of survival whatsoever, you are trapped in poverty. And as Dr. Thabang described it, it is an intergenerational cycle of poverty. It's not just you in this moment of a COVID pandemic are isolated and trapped in poverty. Your parents were trapped, your grandparents were trapped, and there's a continuing culture of failure and impoverishment and disaffection from the state. So that intergenerational cycle of poverty also fuels memories of hardship and of exploitation and of repression over generations, and it's transmitted over generations. We did studies in between 2001 and 2002. I was part of a global commission on human security, and we tried to figure out why were certain places in the world more prone to conflict and violence, and other places were not. And what we found was that it was the memories of victimization, of repression, of exploitation that fueled conflict and violence. And it's not for nothing that we are seeing increasing riots in South Africa, that we are seeing disruptions and violence. And it's not for nothing that there's such high incidence of gender-based violence and femicide. And those are all the symptoms of some of these memories and the transmission of both the history of repression and institutionalized violence, as well as the current context of continuing marginalization and exclusions. So the exclusions are real. They have a real impact, psychological, emotional, and physical impact on the well-being of those people who are especially vulnerable and who are in this age category. Now, if we want to talk numbers, there are approximately 30 million people who are in this age category who are outside of the social security system. Some of them are working, but large numbers of them are not working. So the cost of not acting to include those who are excluded from the economy and from social protection are far worse than the monetary costs of actually introducing a basic income as part of a social protection floor, as a platform, so that people can have a better life. We will not have economic stability and growth. We will not have a reduction in crime. We've done enough research, both nationally and internationally, to show that the chain of causality between violence and conflict and poverty and inequality is direct, and that there are intergenerational cycles of this. So we do have to use alternative ways of thinking about work and of thinking about how income can address income security, even in its most limited and basic form of a small income support measure, will reduce this. Now, there's another point before you move on to the next question. When we consider work, and when we are confronted with the question of, from our citizens and policymakers around why can't people work? The issue is, if you look at gender inequalities and gender disparities, a large part of the unemployed and those who are without paid work and without income, 56% in this age, in this 18 to 59 category are women. At a policy level, women are responsible for the social reproduction of society. They are working. They are part of what today we recognize and talk of as the care economy. They provide care for human beings, for children. They raise children. They raise, they care for the sick and the elderly. They are involved in community services. And during the COVID period, they are the ones who are in the forefront of social services and who are administering healthcare, who are administering drugs, who are providing food. This is work. The issue is it's not recognized. It's unpaid, unwaged work. And I would say that there is no more elasticity for the exploitation of such unpaid work, because they are at their breaking point. The women who are part of this support system, the social economy, the care system, are at their breaking point. And I would see it as a right for them to be given a basic income, because their labor is being exploited with impunity every day. And without their labor, the social fabric of our society, which is already quite fractured, will be even worse. So I think that we do have to consider how we understand work, who is doing the work, and who is being exploited while they are doing it. So from a gender perspective, a basic income grant will provide women with the freedom to make choices about how they work, where they work, and also it will give them the freedom to escape households and partners who are abusive to them. So it gives them the means to have some autonomous decision-making and to protect their bodies. So I think there are many arguments, legitimate evidence-based arguments that will help people understand the value of a basic income grant in this economic climate, as well as in our conditions, social conditions.
Professor Taylor, I could not agree more, and and perhaps this is the weakness or the dangers rather of looking at progress through the lens of GDP, which does not factor in everything that you've just listed now. But before we proceed, I'd just like to bring in the general manager of the African National Congress headquarters, Comrade Phoebe Potgieter, who would also like to make an input. Comrade Phoebe.
Hi, comrades. It's not so much an input, but just a question. And unfortunately, I need to leave because there's another meeting that I'm chairing, but I'll watch it on Facebook afterwards. Two issues. I completely agree with both Comrade Vivian and Comrade Tabang about the dichotomy that's been placed over the last 26 years between job creation and social security, as if it's either or. And in the debate at the moment, that dichotomy is also put forward. So people say, no, we need to enlarge our public employment programs. We need to look at localization, manufacturing, et cetera, as if it's either or. And I think that the perspective and that paradigm shift, that it's not either or, it's part of your entire look at how you structure society, is an important perspective that we need to take forward. The second issue is, which I want both comrades to comment on, if possible, is this question that's being posed about that because we provide a social wage, so people list the, access to education and school fee, fees, free schools to the poor, the basic electricity and water to the indigent, the RDP houses, etc. Because we provide a social wage, therefore not catching everybody in the social security net, which is the unemployed, is somehow makes it okay. And therefore, in a similar way, counterposing between you either spend on the social wage or you spend on the basic income grant, rather than and. So that's the second issue. And then the third issue, which keeps on being raised, and I'd like our speakers to also address it, is this question about how do you fund it? Because it's a question that keeps on raising, that we have scarce resources. Therefore, if you ask us to introduce the basic income grant, then you're taking away, we've got to take it away from somewhere else. So I think that it would be useful to also comment on those issues. But just my last comment, I think that the one of the ways, and looking at the basic income grant in the contemporary period, is the question about the future of work. If you look at young people and youth unemployment globally and the youth labor market globally, for the first time, for the majority of young people across the world, developed and underdeveloped countries, the world, their lives are not going to be better than their parents. For the first time in many generations, the possibility of finding work is either a situation of precarious work or they're completely excluded. So I think that framing this question about a basic income grant and a comprehensive social security in the context of the future of work is an important part of taking forward this debate. But I think that the inputs are really fascinating. And I'll watch on Facebook. Thank you very much, comrades.
No problem. Thanks, GM. And as we indicated at the beginning, I'm very glad that you brought the difficult questions, because I had left them for last. But I think I will go straight to Professor Taylor and then Tawang to address the three questions, or exploratory questions and very important questions that Comrade Phoebe raised. Professor Taylor, you may start, and then Tawang, you'll follow.
Okay, I think that Phoebe Potgieter has raised very important questions. The dichotomy between social protection and jobs came up in 1999, in 2002, when we presented the findings of our committee, the report, and also it comes up continuously. And the issue that, the way it's framed is that people need the dignity of work, and we need to provide them with work, either through public works. So we've seen a proliferation of public works programs, the expanded public works program, the community work program, and public and other programs. Now, many of these programs have served a useful purpose, but they have not been able to absorb the millions of unemployed job seekers, unfortunately. And the manner in which it's administered, the amount of money spent on it, if one does a comparison between the amount of money spent in administering public works programs, the administrative or transactional costs, against what the people who work in those programs actually receive, it's insignificant. And the numbers who are able to be absorbed there for so many person hours or whatever. It's not permanent jobs. It's not, it's you know, just according to certain hours. And so it's also temporary. And there are many issues with it. So when we look at that as an alternative, that was why I suggested that we do have to review how we look at work itself, especially, and I think the last, one of the points that Comrade Phoebe made was the precarious nature of work, the issues around work, and the future of work. So we do need to have a broader understanding of that. And policymakers especially need to understand that this is a reality. If anything, the COVID-19 experience shows us how work is changing as a result of technology, as a result of what is required, and who is able to work under certain conditions, and who is not able to work. So there's a need for us to engage with these issues in a very substantive way, in a policy-directed way, to look at those who have access to technology, who can utilize technology, those jobs that lend themselves to this, and work opportunities that don't, and what happens to the broader issues. So I agree entirely with that idea of shifting the understanding of work and looking at the future of work in a more real way. The issue about the dichotomy between social protection and jobs, it is not an either or. We need people to enter jobs if they have the capabilities and are able to be remunerated, and if they have job security and all that goes with it. If the economy can create those jobs, and if government supports that and ensures that people are placed in jobs, that there's a register of all job seekers who are currently outside the social protection system, and these individuals are placed and given the resources to enter the job market in the long term, of course they would be willing to do that. That is every adult person's preferred option. It is not a choice they are able to make at the moment, because everything is stacked against them, as I said earlier. And so it's a false dichotomy, either social protection or jobs. That's not a policy option that's real. I think that the issue that, the question that Comrade Phoebe asks about looking at a trade-off between comprehensive social protection, including a social floor that has a basic income, and the social wage. The social wage in South Africa constitutes de facto a social protection floor, if one looks at that. And it is what we talked of in the report, in our recommendations, as a comprehensive basket of social goods and services. It includes, as Comrade Phoebe has correctly said, healthcare, primary healthcare. It includes education, and now we have tertiary education also funded. It includes free basic services that are available to everyone universally in South Africa. If you have a house, if you live in a situation where you have piped water and electricity, you get so many liters of water free and so many units of electricity free. It includes transport subsidies, but those subsidies go to the companies that run the transport, not to the commuters.
Right.
And that's the problem. It includes access to housing for people. And so that basket of goods and services does not include access to a basic income, although the Constitution guarantees an access to income support if you do not have any other form of social security. So the push today is to have this comprehensive social wage understood as a social protection floor and include social assistance as well as a basic income as part of it. The social floor also has now a minimum wage through the private sector for those who are within waged employment. So that is another element that, if consolidated as part of this package of goods and benefits, provides a comprehensive system of social protection. There is no trade-off between the social wage and income support, and there shouldn't be. Those who've benefited and who've inherited wealth or who've been getting funding for their studies and constitute a middle income workforce today because they had funding and scholarships and because they've had bursaries or sponsorship, should be able to see the value of income in helping people to move up the class ladder, to be able to support themselves, to engage in other activities. In future, Dr. Tabang mentioned the issue of SMMEs. Without adequate education, without healthcare, with a compromised health system or healthcare, and without access to basic income, people are not going to be able to engage in any economic activity, even at the micro level. And so a consolidated basket of goods and services is what the country needs at the moment to ensure that the needs and futures of all South Africans, especially those right at the bottom, are lifted up. Without that assistance, the disparities will continue, the alienation will continue, and the security and well-being of the entire country is at risk. And crime and violence will remain a feature of South Africa. So I think, how do we fund it? Do you want me to answer that now?
Before I proceed to Tawang, please have a bite.
I'll have a bite at it. This is a question that we have been grappling with for a long time. And of course, funding a basic income grant is very important. We need to look at whether it is, how we can make it feasible. For us in the policy arena and in the research arena, there's enough evidence to show that even under conditions of low economic growth and with fiscal deficits, countries that have been able to build strong social protection systems, inclusive social protection systems, have had faster economic recovery in times of economic and financial crises. They've had better resilience, and their populations have been able to survive without major disruptions. So the issue then is, it's not the fiscal space, it's the political or policy will to ensure that redistribution takes place. How can it take place given our current system of taxation? Of course, the best and the most effective redistributive mechanism to fund a basic income is the tax system. And we do need to have more detailed work done in the country to look at the tax space, to look at how quickly we can introduce a social protection tax that everyone contributes to, that will fund social protection, all the social grants in the medium term and in the long term. We need to look at the intention to introduce a wealth tax and to look at what proportion of that wealth tax can contribute to social protection, to the social protection funding in the long term. And we need to look at how more and more people get into the employment and pay taxes, and how they can contribute through the tax system to a basic income grant. The burden of taxation in the proposals we put forward will be a shared burden, with the wealthy contributing more to cover, through personal income tax, to cover the costs of basic income grant. The additional tax burden of introducing a basic income can be met through raising a social protection tax and through wealth taxes. It can also be raised through looking at assessing the current tax system and looking at the indirect tax benefits that higher income earners get and middle income earners get, and whether those indirect tax benefits or credits should remain a part of the tax system. Because in many ways, one can argue, and I have heard these arguments, that retaining such indirect tax benefits and credits reinforces inequities within the tax system. Because if you are in a higher income bracket and you are getting tax credits, then you are always going to be better off than those who haven't even made it with earning any taxable income. So it's important to look at those aspects. So we do need to have adjustments to the tax system with the principle of promoting social solidarity between taxpayers and non-taxpayers, social intergenerational solidarity between young income earners and older earners as they leave the system. And we need to look at the principle of sustainability, and also affordability and funding is dependent on issues of how much we allocate to individuals, the size of a basic income grant, how we phase in, what are the phased in options for such a grant, because all of that will indicate how we can have a graduated approach that is feasible in terms of cost and funding within the current environment, even though we are in a crisis, but all of that matters. And this is why with the proposals that I shared, I provided an age-based proposal, gender-based, as well as unemployment-based. So those were the three criteria one looked at to phase in a targeted way, a universal income grant. But I think given where we are, it is feasible. It requires a social compact from policymakers together with social partners, and it requires all the country, all members in the country, all citizens coming together and saying, this is essential for the country's well-being and future.
Yes, I think that's a comprehensive response, Prof. And before I move to Thabang, the question of universal basic income begs the question: how universal do we want a basic income to be? In other words, is it an option of paying to all South Africans and clawing it back in the form of tax for those who earn above a particular income? In other words, we're talking about creating a social and economic base for everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status or income in society. How, in your mind, as things stand, would we structure who gets that basic income grant? In other words, there is a problem with, for example, treating unequal people equally. So in other words, you know, so how do you feel we should go about avoiding reproducing inequality, the unintended consequence of treating people equally?
Yeah, I think that when we look at the assumptions in terms of the basic income grant, and we look at a graduated approach given where we are in terms of the country's economic and fiscal situation, we do have to have a target. And I've indicated between 2021 and 2022, we could lower the age of qualifying for a social old age pension to people between the ages of 58 and up to 59. Okay, and that will cost of all those people who would have access to such a pension. We estimate that between 30% or 50% of the over 57, 58 years old and 59 years old will be part of this system. And if they enter the social old age pension, they would immediately be out of poverty, and it would cost the country between 5 and 8 billion rand, which is very feasible. In the second 2 years, 2022 and 2024, we suggest that people between the ages of or over 55 up to 57 get into the social old age pension system. and they would also get a grant. And that is also feasible, even within the current fiscal constraints, because it's about the total that it would cost the country. We've done these calculations, would be about 14 billion. Okay, the estimates are those people who would qualify. So immediately we are whittling away at the numbers who are currently part of that 30 million that we talked about.
18 to 59 or so.
Yes, the 18 to 59, because the others are already part of that system, of the social protection system. Then we are left with the big ticket item of making a grant universal and targeting those who are without income. And our calculations show that we could do that by 2025 or 2027. And it would require, as I said, adjustments to the tax structure. All employed persons would receive the 500 Rand, and we pegged the grant at 500 Rand so that it would take people out of poverty. It would be an individual grant out of food poverty, and it would be payable in its entirety as part of a tax deduction for those who are earning above a certain level. So it would be, there would be equity built into that tax system so that those who are below the tax or not in the tax system would not be paying anything for the grant, but only those who are above a certain tax threshold will be paying towards this grant. So higher paid employees would pay a higher amount so that the full gross cost of the grant is paid. And this is in line with the principle that we talk of tax equity and subsidiarity, where the wealthy are subsidizing the poor. So that would have to be built in. And this is why we need adjustments to the tax structure. And additional funding, as I already said, to cover the gap in funding through the tax system could be covered from a special designated form of social protection tax. As the economy grows, as more people enter the work, they will also contribute to basic income grant. And the basic income grant will be there and available to everyone if you suddenly have a disaster in your life and are no longer able to work, or if your health expenditure is such that you are not able to feed yourself, the basic income grant should be available to you as well, whether you were formally educated or not. Or say your pension collapses because of corruption in the pension system and you are left without an income. You are educated, you have a house, you should be entitled or available to a basic income for your survival. So that's the value of having a universal basic income. It's available to everyone in good times and when crisis hits us. And it has to be part of a long-term, a medium-term and a long-term strategy. And it has to be financed through the tax system.
No, I think you gave a comprehensive enough response. And what is exciting is that you already have some of these models put in place, various pathways through which South Africa gradually get there within her means. Thabang, I think you got the questions from the GM, but just to repeat, it was in the main of whether a basic income should be seen as an either or to the social wage, and where if we were to agree, to the extent that we agree that the basic income is both necessary, affordable, and feasible, what would be socially and sustainable, or rather socially just and sustainable ways of actually funding it, in your opinion?
Okay, I've heard some of what Professor Taylor was saying, and I think she covered it quite comprehensively. So I'm going to add two things to what she's already said. So the first thing that I'll add is that this idea of the double approach that that I referred to in the paper is precisely an attempt to expose this false dichotomy between job creation and a comprehensive social security system. And the idea of the double approach is to really say it's not an either or. We need both. We need both. So there's no longer a need to think in a dichotomous way. We need both interventions in order to address the magnitude of the crisis that we are in. And then I think the other issue that I might want to add to what Professor Taylor said is that, you know, the basic income grant should not be seen as it's not there to replace other grants. So it should not be seen as something that should replace the child grant, the disability grant, or the old age grant. So here we're talking about something completely different. We're talking about a basic minimum level of subsistence for everyone, regardless of employment conditions, regardless of age, and other discriminatory factors that feature in policy making. Now, and the basic income itself should also not be replaced by food vouchers or food parcels or anything of that sort. It should be a cash injection paid on a frequent basis to an individual, without means testing, unconditionally. And it should not be withdrawable if a person gets a job. Right. So, and it can start at a very small level and then gradually increase depending on the resources that are available. And, the pathways that Prof. Taylor presented, I think that in terms of the funding question, so one thing I believe, sorry?
I think the critical question.
Yeah, it's a critical question. And, I think that the question of funding should not be used as a delay tactic to implement the basic income. And government and treasury will need to not just say it's unaffordable. And I know there's this, position that people say it's unaffordable. The conversation can't stop at it's unaffordable, right? If you want to do something and you don't have the money to do it now, you plan for it, right? You plan for it, and then over time you achieve it. So, for example, let me make an example, and I believe that we will need to do a pilot studies in various communities in South Africa, rural Limpopo, Northwest, townships in the Free State, Northern Cape, and other areas. We'll need to do pilots of the basic income to really get some of the nitty-gritties that will need to go into the implementation of it. And that will also give us a sense of how best to implement it in South Africa. And the SRD has also given us some lessons on how we can, so we've been gradually improving our social security system in the country over time. And the conditions in as far as systems are concerned, I think we're at a much better place to begin thinking about that. So if we are to implement, and I'm answering the funding question, so if we are to implement the basic income grant, say for instance, if we want to do a pilot first, maybe over a period of 8 months or so, that gives our colleagues at the Treasury enough time to come up with the financial instruments to fund this income grant. And Treasury will then need to come up with a plan. And some of the instruments that can be looked at, and I believe they should be looked at, is part of what Professor Taylor was alluding to. A revised tax system, a progressive tax system, adjustment to the tax structure, and so on. So yeah, so the question of affordability should not close down the conversation. It should actually open it up. And Treasury, and I believe every other social partner must come up with a plan to make this thing feasible. But yeah, it is feasible.
Thanks for that, Tawang. I guess it brings me to another question which others have been asking, which is, can we afford not to have it? Because the consequences of not having basic social and economic security for that population that Professor Taylor speak to, which is between 18 years and 59, to me sounds particularly to be one welfare-ish monstrosity on top of the very fiscus that we are intending to preserve. I will then come back to Professor Taylor. In fact, this is for both of you to give your any other insight that you wish to make in closing. Given that for me, you have both described what a basic, where a basic income grant comes from, both globally and here at home. You have unpacked the intended or targeted beneficiaries. You have unpacked various pathways, gradual pathways that South Africa could take. You have also emphasized that it's not an either-or situation to the social wage. If anything, it's complementary. You have also listed various or potential sources of revenue, including the significance of a pilot that Thabang has just raised now. And a pilot, not so much as a can that's being kicked down the road, but a can in order to generate contextual and localized evidence to inform the best way forward, but also to give policymakers time to build these funding models. But I cannot forget the point you emphasized, Professor Taylor, which is that all of this is built on a foundation of a society driven by solidarity. And I cannot overemphasize the significance of solidarity, because without solidarity, nothing other than the borders within which we find ourselves brings us together. And so I think the question of solidarity needs to be emphasized. Of course, earlier on, we also touched on the reality that a basic income, insofar as it preserves human security as well as one may add national security, it's not so much about preserving the well-being of those at the bottom of the food chain, but also preserves the totality of South Africa's stability for both the well-off and those at the bottom of the ladder. So both of you may give your closing remarks, and I cannot overemphasize how insightful this conversation has been. As the general manager indicated, of course, this is a series of conversations that the African National Congress is facilitating in order to generate the best possible evidence and insights from those who have walked this path. It may be even time to emphasize or to indicate that Our next guest, depending on availability, will likely be the Statistician General, in order to break down, give us a breakdown of the true or the latest socioeconomic profile of South African households and communities, in order to drive the point home that both of you have made, that unless we reimagine how we look at South Africa, we will try the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Unfortunately, we're in a pandemic, well, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, because so much of our resources will depend on how we, within the spirit of solidarity, rebuild from the COVID ashes together. So closing statement from both of you. I will start with you, Thabang, and then we will end with Professor Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Mokove. So in my closing remarks, I would like to just, just mention some of the pilot findings that have been, for example, drawn from Namibia, which I found very interesting and I would like to share on this platform as well. So they did a pilot between 2008 and 2009 in a small village of Itoveru Imitara in Namibia, covering about 1,000 people, with each person getting about 100 Namibian dollars. And the results from that included the findings that a basic income led to better nutrition in the community, because people would use that money to buy food. It also led to better health, because people, were eating better and were also having better access to medical facilities and so on. It also increased school attendance and significantly reduced the dropout rate, and also reduced or recorded a significant fall in petty crimes of people stealing vegetables and livestock and so on, because they could now buy it for themselves. In terms of economic activities, it did not make people lazy. Okay, as opponents often say, the results showed that instead of making people lazy, it led to people creating new forms of work for themselves at the grassroots. And people did not have to depend on, just the fact of having a job for subsistence. So the idea of work, rather than just focusing on a job, so the idea of work becomes a possibility through the basic income grant, right? And even in other case studies, in the village of Madhya Pradesh in India, people used that money to collectively buy fertilizers, seeds, livestock, and farming equipment, and started producing food for themselves and in the community. Others bought sewing machines and started making clothes, and they used some of the money to, some of them used it to pay off debts and gain some economic freedom. In both cases, the basic income grant increased the amount of work that people were able to do for themselves in their communities and in order to improve their own lives. So, and those that had jobs reported better work performance and well-being. So the basic income doesn't seem to disincentivize people from going to work. Instead, it makes it possible for people to create new forms of work in their communities, in the grassroots, because they now have a small amount of money to build from. So I think that it's another opportunity, it's another benefit that has been shown in various pilots. The point is that by people creating their own work and engaging in local economic activities, this also helps government to achieve its target of reducing unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Yeah, so as a way of closure, I would like to point out to that, that there are studies that show this, but I think we need to do it in South Africa as well, to come up with a tailor-made implementation for South Africa. The important point to emphasize is that this should not be used as a delay tactic to implement the basic income. Research is important. We need to gather the evidence and understand what will work, what will not work. But we do need some kind of commitment that this basic income needs to be implemented in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, Thabang. Before I move to Professor Taylor, Thabang, you did some work, particularly during your doctoral studies, on the experiences of former gold mine workers. And I wondered if your experience with that constituency could shed any light on what kind of role a basic income would play in that kind of situation. These are people on whose labor our wealth is built, of course.
That's right. And so the study was conducted in Welkom in the Free State, and it was a study that looked at the long-term unemployed, so people that had been retrenched from the mines and having no income and very little economic opportunities in their local communities. Now, the key finding, let me just highlight the key finding of my PhD was that, people saw jobs as a desirable source of self-worth and meaning. And when they lost their jobs, they suffered immensely. And the kind of suffering that they endured was not only because of poverty, it was not only because they didn't have an income. They suffered a diminished sense of self-worth, a diminished sense of confidence, precisely because jobs are not merely instrumental to people. People attach a sense of dignity, identity, and a sense of meaning to the jobs that they do. And once they lose a job, it's like their entire world crumble. And so they experience unemployment as humiliation and devastation that not only wrecks their pockets, but wrecks their existence as a whole. So in response to that, they tried all sorts of activities to overcome this diminished sense of self-worth by engaging in a number of activities. Some of them stood by the side of the road. I think it's a very common sight to see men, especially men, waiting by the side of the road for day jobs. So they tried that. Some of them engaged in recycling, particularly scrap metal collection, and they were submitted to the buyback centers. Some of them, relied on remittances from children that were employed or other family members that could help from time to time. And social grants also came out as one of the key interventions that made a difference in families that had recipients of social grants. But of course, the mine workers themselves, the ex-mine workers themselves, didn't see these interventions as adequate for the kind of dignity and status that they associate with jobs. Now, I did ask them about a basic income or an unemployment grant, and ask them what would it mean to them if government were to give them a small amount of money each month for basic subsistence. So what their response was that they would accept the money for subsistence, but they believed that jobs were more desirable. Now, of course, I mean, this is to be expected. It's not a surprising thing, especially because mine workers come from, a very strong tradition of labor. Of labor. So now, what was clear is that they want jobs. They don't want grants, but they would take grants for subsistence, not as a substitute for jobs. And that aligns very well with what we've been saying in this panel, right? Indeed, a basic income is for basic subsistence. It's not a replacement for jobs. And that's the kind of position that mine workers saw it from as well. Many of the ex-mine workers had injuries that they had sustained, occupational injuries. They would show me scars that were caused by falling rocks and so on their bodies. And some of them would show me fractures on their bodies sustained from labor in the mines. And some of them had silicosis, the silicosis TB. And the biggest problem was that they often did not have money to go to the local clinic to get medication when medication runs out. And many of them had to take this medication on empty stomachs. Their families would often go to bed hungry. And if one of the things is that they would have water, water or water with whatever that's there. Some of them just relied on eating peaches. So a lot of households there, and I wondered why a lot of households had peach trees in their yards. And when I asked, it was simply because, they would be able to store those peaches and eat them whenever they needed some kind of food. Now, it's clear that a basic income would make a huge difference in these kind of communities where the job prospects are very low, other economic activity opportunities are very low, and people are in dire need of some kind of basic subsistence. So in that light, it's quite clear that even for mine workers and other groups, for ex-mine workers and other groups, domestic workers and so on, it's clear that a basic income would make a huge difference in those people's lives. And we may find ourselves seeing new kinds of work that no one of us is able to come up with now, that no policymaker can dream up now sitting here, but communities themselves may, in fact, collectively take collective action into securing their own economic independence. And I think that it's in the light of what Prof. Taylor was alluding to, solidarity. So basic income would provide a basis for people to do, some kind of collective work together. And yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Tabang, and thanks for that work that you've done. And I think this is why we're saying, a pilot would be, very helpful. Professor Taylor, you'll have the last word.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokwevu and Dr. Bang. I think that the discussion hopefully has stimulated a lot of thinking and provided a basis for further discussion and engagement, especially by policymakers. In the introduction, we saw how a delay in implementing an evidence-based research proposal to address mass-based poverty in South Africa has led to a situation today where it's extremely difficult to address the needs of an emerging middle class. The bottom has fallen out during COVID-19. Bottom has fallen out of the middle class. Many people have been pushed to the wall. We've had research that told us that most emerging Black middle class people who were in employment had been living with a monthly debt of 7,000. During the COVID period, they have been pushed to the wall and will not be able to pay back their debts. So their economic circumstances have been compromised. The issue then is, have the upper income and the 1% who are the extremely wealthy been able to survive this COVID experience and the financial consequences of it intact? And yes, of course, they have been cushioned to a large extent. So we ask ourselves, how has the South African government and policymakers delivered on the political and democratic imperative that led us to look at the transformation of both economic and social policies? How have we created that people-centered society or that people-driven society when the very people, the 30 million people between the ages of over 18 and 59 remain outside of any social protection system, remain outside of work that is decent and that is predictable and that gives them a sense of well-being, that gives them the freedom to choose how they live? How has that political and democratic imperative been met? So that is a question that policymakers need to apply themselves to. And it is not about trade-offs between work. As we said, we have to look at what we mean by work. What type of work? Who is doing the work? And how is this work being commodified? If we impute a market value to much of the work that women do, we would find that it would add significantly to the national accounts and to the GDP. So that's one factor to take into account when we look at how we ensure that we have policies that empower and enable women, especially those who are living in extreme poverty, to move out of that extreme poverty and to become agents of change in their own lives. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way is Without an effective social protection system, including a basic income, we are unlikely to generate the economic recovery that we must have for South Africa to be put on a stable footing. So the issue of economic recovery and social recovery is important, but it's not going to happen if we are following the same path that we've trod over the last 2 decades. That path has led us to a space of more inequalities and deepening poverty because we are part of an interdependent global system. And so we have to think differently about our economy and about whose economic well-being and economic inclusion should be prioritized. So that's another factor to take into account. We won't have long-term resilience, social and economic resilience as a country, if we do not have sustained human development through this package of social protection measures that we are talking about. That has to be strengthened and consolidated into the social protection floor, together with a basic income. I've heard the very important arguments about testing the feasibility of implementation of a basic income. Now, over the past 2 decades, we've had a strengthened social security system. We have a strengthened institution to administer social security. We have had the emergence of what some call a small basic income to children up to the age of 18. If we want to take lessons from that, both the value of that in terms of the returns to health, the returns to human development, to education, the returns to integration into other systems, then there are adequate lessons from the child support grant over the years. And there are adequate lessons of running and administering a system. The issue then becomes, how can we introduce a basic income grant, keeping in mind that we need this assistance within the next 5 years if we are going to reduce food poverty to 0, which is a target in the National Development Plan that all parties agreed to. All political parties agreed to that target, reduce food poverty by 0 by 2030. We will not be able to do that if there isn't the political will or the policy choice to introduce a universal basic income. We provide a graduated phased-in approach so that it is not going to deter or affect the financing of it during this period. It is possible, it is feasible, it's administratively feasible. People need that grant now. There's enough evidence both in South Africa, research-based evidence, comparative evidence in other countries in Africa, Mauritius, Seychelles, in Algiers, in many other countries around the world where they've introduced some basic income support. And I think we can use that research evidence to look at the potential pitfalls. But I would argue very strongly that the time for pilots, the time for good intentions, given the current crisis we are in, is no more. We do not have another 2 decades of waiting. 2 decades or even a decade more will ruin the potential that we have in the country to provide a bottom-up process of development and ensure redistribution and social justice. It must be now.
Professor Taylor, thank you so much. Dr. Sfalafala, I cannot tell you how grateful I am to both of you on behalf of the African National Congress and everybody who's been watching. This is not just for ANC members, it's streamed live precisely because it's supposed to reach every South African who has an interest in the basic social and economic security of every one of us. I wish to close by repeating a case study that Professor Taylor mentioned from as far back as just under two decades ago about a lady who threw herself in front of a train precisely because she felt she could not provide for her own child. A basic income grant is not about making people rich. It's not about replacing people's ability, intention, or willingness to work. It's about making sure that all of us have some kind of safety net that should preserve us or protect us from falling over a cliff that so many of South Africans and even beyond our borders, people are in the precarity or precariat precisely because of the declining in wages and the elusive project of job creation. And I hope this hasn't been a complete waste of your time. I wish to close by Thomas More's view on the basic income, who saw it as a humane way to not only put food on people's table, but also a better way to reduce crime as compared to hanging people. And he said no penalty on earth will stop people from stealing if it is their only way of getting food. Instead of inflicting these horrible punishments, it would be far more to the point to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody is ever under the frightful necessity of becoming a thief first and then a corpse later. With those few, well, not so few words really, I wish to once again thank both Professor Taylor and I just gave you a promotion at Tawang, Dr. Sfalafala and Professor Taylor, who were our guests. This is not the last of this session. We should have the Statistician General next, depending on his availability. And then I think the next possible stop could be the unions. The basic income idea has a funny way of uniting technocrats and technopreneurs in Silicon Valley, as well as shops, factory floor shop stewards. It has a funny way of bringing together Professor Milton Friedman on the one hand and Joseph Stiglitz on the other. And in fact, Professor Guy Standing said that we should not be opposed to an idea simply because of who else supports it. And so for those who think this is an upward battle, we need to remember that the people in the United Kingdom who are today willing to lay their lives in protection of the National Health Service were once part of constituencies which were violently against it. And so there's time also has a funny way of revealing ways in which we can imagine a better society for all. And thanks so much for everyone who joined us. Thanks Tawang, and thanks Prof. Taylor. And hopefully we take this momentum forward. And thank you so much for making time.
Thank you. And